Hi everyone, and welcome to a new Programming.net tutorial. In our previous two videos, we started looking at JavaScript, and in the first one, we kind of looked at JavaScript as a programming language, right? We covered a few concepts such as variables and different types of variables, strings and numbers and arrays. We went over the for loop and the if statements, and we generated some random numbers. We also looked at the console log, which is probably the most useful thing I know in JavaScript. And in the second video, we started looking into how we can make JavaScript talk to our HTML pages, right? And the example that we built was this little website where every time the user goes to the page or reloads the page, the background color changes, right? So we kind of took the randomization code from the other script and made it a little bit more complex and applied that to the background color. Today, very exciting, we're going to get even deeper into manipulating HTML from inside of JavaScript. And this is kind of like the core of web programming, right? Like being able to kind of deal with this idea of state, which is the constant back and forth of the interaction between user and the website. Whenever the user does something to the website, sometimes the website needs to remember to either like change the page or show a certain part of the current page or open a modal box or open a form, right? So like pretty much what we see on most existing websites. That's that collection of things that are being shown and hidden, and the stylings that are applied to them based on the user inputs. The collection of all of those is called state, right? And JavaScript is used in order to maintain and update the state of a website based on how the user interacts with it. So we're going to start with something super simple where we're going to add a button and a div, let's say a colored square. And we're going to make that colored square appear and disappear and reappear and redisappear every time we press the button. And kind of at a high level, in order to achieve this interaction, we need to do a few things. First, we need to define our button and our div in HTML, which is kind of what we've been doing so far, just writing HTML. We're going to learn the button HTML tag, which is very exciting. And then we need to use JavaScript in order to detect when our button is clicked, right? So we're going to add an event listener for the click event to our button. And then once this click is happening, we need to get a hold of the div of the square that we want to show and hide and change its style so that it appears and disappears. So let's get started. I have here an empty glitch project. Let's see, I didn't remove readme, but I'm going to remove it now. I deleted everything except for the title, which is not to-do list. That's going to be our next video. Show hide. It's show hide. The style sheet and the script, which are both empty. All right, so I'm going to show the preview next to the code, and I'm going to start by declaring a button. So the button tag is simply button, and then I think we also have to give it a type attribute which says button, and we have to add some text inside of the between the opening and the closing tag of the button, and that text is going to appear on the button, right? So right now it's a button which doesn't really do anything. And I'm going to place all of these on the same line. And let's also create a div which is what we want to show and hide. And this is just going to be a simple div. I'm going to give it a class. I'll just call it a circle. Let's make it a circle, not a square. Div class equals circle. There's not going to be anything inside of it. And inside of our style.css, let's style it. Let's first give it a width of 200, height of 200. Let's give it a background color of no, orange. I kind of like the pink. Pink, let's give it a margin top. So there's a little bit of a spacing between it and the button of like 10 pixels, maybe 20. And let's turn it into a circle from a square. And if you remember from a previous CSS tutorial, the way to do that is by giving it a border radius. And I'm going to give it a border radius of exactly half of its width and height, so 100 pixels, and that should turn it into a circle. Great. So we have kind of our two structural elements in here, right? The button and the circle, and we want to show and hide the circle when the button is pressed. Great. So now comes the JavaScript part. And I'm going to sort of keep going back and forth between HTML and JavaScript, and you'll see why. I'm also going to open the console, Command Option I if you're on a Mac. I think it's Control Alt I if you're on Windows, or you can also just right click, hit the inspect element, and then go to the console from there. Great, so let's go inside of our script.js, and remember from our last tutorial I was mentioning that in order to write code that interacts with HTML from inside of JavaScript, we need to attach an event listener for the DOM content loaded event, right? This is when JavaScript tells us that the whole HTML has loaded and we can start interacting with it. So I'm going to do that, right? It's the same code as the previous tutorial. Window.add event listener DOM content loaded, and then a function in which we're going to write our code, right? And all of our code needs to go inside of this function. So let's just do a console log for now to make sure we didn't make any mistakes in typing this. Content loaded. Okay, great. So those are old errors. If we refresh, we should just be seeing DOM content loaded. Amazing. And now we need to do a few things, right? We need to first detect whenever the user clicks on this button. In order to do that, we need to get a hold of this button from JavaScript, right? In our previous tutorial, we talked to the body, which was just document.body in order to change its color. However, this is more specific than the body, right? And in order to address it, we're going to give it an ID. Maybe you remember the ID from when we did links for within the same web page, right? Like anchor links. That's where we used the IDs before. But it's just an attribute whose value can be equal to anything. So in our case, I'm just going to call it our button. Maybe, no, that's not a good name. Maybe show height button. You can use dashes. You can just, I don't think you can separate by space. Maybe you can, I'm not fully sure. But try not having spaces inside of that name. So what we're going to do is we're going to ask JavaScript to give us the element with this ID. And then we're going to attach a click event listener to that. And the way that goes is we're going to create a variable var button element equals, and in order to ask JavaScript to give us the element with a certain ID, we're going to type document dot get element by ID, open and close parentheses, and then this get element by ID function takes one string parameter, which is the ID of the element that we want to address. In our case, is show height button. All right, so nothing is happening quite yet because we just assigned this element to a variable, but we should print it. Let's see what's in there. So console.log button elements. And there we go. This is our button. It's an HTML, or like it shows up as an HTML element. Great, right? So this is quite similar to when you print documents to the console log and you see the whole HTML of the page, except that it happens for one single element. The other thing to mention about IDs is that within an HTML document, IDs should be unique, right? Like there should be no other element on this page that has the same show hide button ID. This is just something to keep in mind. I'm not quite sure how this function works if you have multiple elements with the same ID. Maybe it just returns the first one of them, but that can cause bugs and problems in the code, so make sure to keep your IDs unique. Great, so now let's detect the click. And the way this works is, I was saying, we're going to attach an event listener. JavaScript is sort of an event-based programming language. Or like one of the things that's happening in JavaScript is that you can work with events. I was talking about this a little bit in class or in a previous tutorial. And I was mentioning how, because it's meant for creating interactive pieces of code, user interaction doesn't necessarily flow in a linear fashion, kind of like time does, right? Like you need to be able to respond specifically to certain actions that the user is doing, and that's what event listeners are for. So I'm going to say button element dot add event listener, and this add event listener function takes two parameters. The first parameter is a string, which is the name of the event, and there are a few predefined events by JavaScript, right? Like if we just gave it a random name of the event, that event would never get fired. So we need to like use predefined events. In our case, the event is called click, right? So that's the first part, what event we want to respond to. And the second part is our actual piece of code, which is what we want to do when this event fires. And for this, we're going to create a new function that deals with this click. So I'm just going to call that function on button click. Right, so right now we're getting an error saying that on button click is not defined, so we need to create it. So I'm going to go outside of our windows.addEventListener.contentLoaded and create that. So I'm going to say function on button click. I'm not going to give it any arguments for now. And inside of here, I'm just going to print a message to the console to kind of know when this function is being called, right? So let's just say console.log button was clicked. Okay, so nothing. Let's clear out the console for our peace of mind. We see that nothing is really happening right now. Let's refresh the page. We get the DOM content loaded, and then the moment we click our button, we get the message in the console, right? Button was clicked. If we click again, you see the 2 popping up over there, which is just Chrome's console bundling messages together. So the more we press it, the more times this function gets called. So the cool thing is that this function and any code that we write inside of it only gets executed whenever the user clicks on the button. If you haven't worked with functions before in C or C++, they're simply a way to kind of make code more modular, right? And to kind of batch together pieces of code that do a one specific thing. In our example, it's a function that simply will hide this circle, hide or show this circle over here. Yeah, let's get into showing and hiding the circle, and then we can do another overview of the code overall. So in order to show and hide the circle, we also need to be able to reference the circle's HTML element, right? And we can do that by, again, attaching an ID to the circle. So we'll just say ID equals the circle. So what we want to do inside of our script, we want to get a hold of that element, and then we could change its style to hide it. So I'm going to say var circle element equals document dot get element by ID the circle. Let's print the circle to make sure that we didn't make any typing errors inside of the ID or any other mistakes. So let's refresh the page, let's click, and there we go. We can see the div of our circle printed to the console. So this is working. And in order to, let's do the hiding part first, right? In order to hide it, we could just say circle element dot style dot display equals none. Right, display none is a CSS property that you can use in order to hide an element. So whenever we click on our button, we see that our circle disappears. If we inspect our element on, sorry, this is just glitches frame of this page. Right, this is our circle, and we see that our display none property got added on top of what we already had in our CSS from circle. If we deactivate this, our circle is going to show up again. I'm gonna go back to the console. If only I could find it. Okay, there we go. However, this is just half of what we were trying to achieve, right? Like if we keep clicking, it's not going to show up again. So we kind of need to add a little bit of logic into this, right? And kind of think along the lines of, if the circle is currently hidden, then we need to change its CSS to be currently visible. Alternatively, if the circle is currently visible and the user presses the button, we need to hide the circle. There are a few ways we could do that. One of them would be to go directly through the style, which I think we're going to do right now. Let's just go directly through the style, and then we can also see later how we can attach CSS classes to elements from JavaScript. So we can say something like if circle element dot style dot display is equal to none, right? So if the circle is currently invisible, then we need to bring it back. So we'll say circle element style dot display equals, I forget what's the regular property for display. So I'm just going to check in here. Okay, yeah, block should be fine, because yeah, it's a div, so the original is block. So we're going to give it a display block. Else, which means that the circle is currently visible, we're going to bring the circle element dot style dot display equals to none. So we're going to hide it. So right now, if we refresh, let's go back into our console, clear it out. If we click show hide once, it's going to disappear. If we click again, it's going to appear. Right, so it flips the state every time we click the button, kind of like a light switch. Okay, great. So now that we have done this, let's get to doing an example that's a little bit more complex than this. And we could implement something like a Modal Box, which is like quite used on the internet. It's this kind of stuff, right, where you get kind of a dialog that pops in front of you as the user on a web page with like a semi-transparent background, and that can be closed afterwards. So in order to do that, let's go back to our script. And I'm going to actually create a new button for the modal box, and then we're going to design our modal box, and then we're going to implement the JavaScript logic that opens it and that closes it. Okay, so new button with a new ID. I'm just going to say button ID equals modal box button, type equals button, open modal box. Okay, let's give it a class as well, so we can push it a little bit further down. Modal box button. See, in this instance, I have the same ID and class for this button. That's usually not a problem. You can do that if you oops. Oh, I accidentally got out of the project. You can do that if you want, right? You can have the same ID name and class name for an element, and that should be fine. Sorry about that. We're getting back into the project. Okay, great. I'm going to close the console for now and show the website next to the code. All right, so let's style it. Let's see in here, .modal box button. And when we have a dot in front of the name, this speaks to the class, not to the ID, right? So if we have multiple buttons with this class, they're all going to get this style. And I'm just gonna say margin top 20 pixels, just to push it down a little bit. All right. So in order to implement something like this, the way these things work is that it's actually an HTML element which is covering the whole width and the whole height of the page. Most of it has a background color that's black at like maybe 10% opacity, right? So it's super transparent, and then it actually has a div with some stuff in it, right? And then an X button which brings you back to the original page. So we're going to start by kind of designing our modal box on top of the page, and then implementing the JavaScript to show it and hide it based on when this button is clicked and when on the X element on it is clicked. It's not going to be as neat as this one. It's not going to be as nicely animated as this one, but it's going to be kind of the same kind of logic. Great. So I'm going to create a new div. I'll give it the class modal box container, and I'm also going to give it an ID modal box, and we're going to deal with the ID later when we get into JavaScript. And for now, let's just style the container. So we said we want it to be full screen, full width and full height. And no matter how, the other thing about modals is like no matter where in the page you're scrolled, it kind of like shows up at the same place, right? So it has a position fixed as opposed to being able to scroll through it. So we're gonna say position fixed, top 0, left 0. We're gonna give it a width of 100 VW, which is 100% of the window width, a height of 100 VH, which is 100% of the window height, and then a background color of a very transparent black, right? So let's say RGBA 000, which is black, and then an alpha of 0.1. Let's maybe make it 0.3, make it a little bit darker. Okay, so this is our background. And now we need to add the actual box on it. We see that in this example that we're looking at, the box is sort of centered horizontally. Yeah, horizontally. and kind of to the top vertically. And I always confuse horizontal and vertical. I don't know what's wrong with me. So we're just gonna say display flex direction. Doesn't really matter, but we can just say row. Let's just like center everything in here for simplicity. Line items center, justify content center, right? So we're just kind of preparing ourselves to center whatever content we add to this div. Okay, and inside of it, we're going to add a div, which is going to be this white box that actually contains the text of our model, right? So we're going to give it a class modal box content, and let's style that as well. Not modal box content, and let's see. Let's make it 300 pixels wide. We're just gonna use like fixed sizes for this, and a height of, let's say, 200 pixels. Let's give it a background color of white. Right, so we see it appearing in the middle of our page, and we're like slowly getting to what's going on in here. I see that they have rounded corners, so let's give it a small border radius of, let's say, 5 pixels to round our corners a little bit and make it look friendlier. We can make it even wider, actually. Let's make it 400. And then we need to add some content inside of it. We could maybe give it like a title and some dummy content, kind of like what they have in here, and then add a closing button. And we're gonna do all of that from HTML. So let's say div class equals title row, and then h3. This is a modal. Okay, and then let's create another div with the content. Div class equals content row. This is the content. Okay, let's maybe add a horizontal rule in between them to try mimicking what they're doing over in the Bootstrap example. HR. Okay, and this is not styled at all. It looks pretty bad, but the intent here is to kind of recreate the interaction rather than make it look exactly the same. Okay, I'm going to rearrange this code a little bit. I just put the h3 on the same line. Let's see. Let's give some padding to these pieces of text. So let's do title row padding left 20 pixels, and content row padding left 20 pixels. Let's also give it a padding top of 15 maybe. I'm just eyeballing things right now. Great. Okay, so we pretty much have a basic mock-up of this modal. So what we need to do right now is to create the interaction that opens it when we click on the button, and then we're going to add a little X over here, a closing button, and have that close it whenever we click. So in order to open it, that's going to be actually very similar to what we did with the show height for our circle earlier on, in that we need, let's go back to our HTML, we need an ID for our modal box, and we have an ID for our modal box, right? And we have our modal box button. Okay, great. So inside of JavaScript, I'm going to create a new variable for the new button, and I'm going to say var modal button element equals document.get element by ID. I forgot the ID of the button. Modal box button. And then again, we're going to add a click event listener to it. So we're gonna say button element, modal button element dot add event listener click. And we're going to create another function that opens our modal, and we're gonna call that on open modal. Glitch is complaining about the fact that we haven't defined our function yet, so let's define it, and we'll say function open on open modal, open and close our parentheses. And in order to be able to test this code, we should first hide the modal, right? Like the default state whenever you go to a page is that the modal is not showing up. And then whenever you click on a button, it does show up. So let's give it a default class of a default CSS property of display none, right? So modal box container. Let's actually create different classes. Let's create a hidden class, which is going to say display none, and a visible class, which is going to say display block. Right, so now if we go inside of HTML and give our modal box the class modal box container and then the class hidden, it should disappear, right? So what we're going to do in order to show and hide our modal is that we're just going to change from JavaScript the classes that this div is taking, right? So it's going to be visible and hidden. Okay, so whenever we click on the button, let's open our console and again do the whole console log thing to make sure that we're actually clicking. I'm going to expand the window a little bit. Console log on open modal. Okay, so we see the message, which means that our function is getting executed. We want to get the element by ID again, so we'll say var modal element equals document.get element by ID, and the ID was modal box. Great. And now what we're doing differently from the circle is that instead of manipulating its CSS directly, we're going to manipulate its class, right? And in order to do that, we can use a different function called setAttribute. SetAttribute in JavaScript allows you to manipulate any of the HTML attributes that you see or define inside of HTML by hand, right? So now we're going to manipulate the class attributes. So for now, let's just open and we'll deal with the closing afterwards. So let's say modal element dot set attribute, and this set attribute function takes two parameters. The first one is the name of the attribute, which in our case is class, and the second one is the value of that attribute, which in our case is going to be, I believe we need to give it everything that was inside of the original class declaration, right? So we need to give it modal box container and then hidden or visible. So in this case, it's going to be modal box container and visible. Right, so what we did is whenever the user clicks on this button, we get the HTML element associated with the modal box, the whole container, and give it the CSS visible class so that it shows up. It's showing up a little bit funky because we might have messed up its CSS by setting the attributes. Let's take a look. In instances like this, I wish I had a larger screen. Okay, let's see. So we have Modal Box, which is visible. Oh, right. So invisible with defined display block. However, that took over the definition of display flex that we had initially created, right? So we need to make visible, give the element display flex instead of display block. That was our mistake. Okay, so now when we open the modal box, things should be centered and should be looking the way they looked earlier. All right, so now we should also do the closing part of this. And in order to do the closing, we could create a little X button over there on in the top right side. The way I usually do those X buttons, it's not the best way, but it's the easiest way. If you look for Unicode X, Unicode is kind of an extended character set that includes emojis and a bunch of other things. You can kind of take this character and paste it inside of HTML. Let's make it h2 in size and see what happens. We're going to need to make it visible by default just so we can work with it. So I'm going to change its class from hidden to visible. There we go. We earned some real estate. Okay, so yeah, we see an X. Maybe it's a little big. Maybe let's try making it an H4. And yeah, that looks like the right size. And we want to have it on the same line as the header. The way to do that would be to set display flex on the title row, right? So let's go in the title row and say display flex direction row. Yep, and then we want justify content space between, maybe. Yeah, there we go. Right, so now we have the first element all the way to the left and the second element all the way to the right. Let's give it some padding right as well. I'll give it 20 pixels as well. Yeah, that's good enough for now. All right, so we want, whenever the user clicks on this, we want the modal to close. Yeah, we also want the cursor to turn into a pointer whenever hovering over it, right? Right now it turns into kind of like the text editing cursor. So let's deal with the cursor first with the CSS. Let's give it a class, class equals close button, and let's also give it an ID, modal close button, and we're gonna deal with the ID in JavaScript and with the class in CSS. So we're just gonna say dot close button, and in order to turn the cursor into the little hand, we have to say cursor pointer, right? So now we see it becoming the hand that signifies a link. Okay, so now we've given it an ID, right, which is the modal close button. And even though it's an H4 element, we can do the same thing, the add event listener for click, and then do our action whenever the user clicks on it. So the good thing to remember here is that buttons can have click event listeners attached to them, but also any other kind of HTML element can have a click attached to it. So let's get it by ID, right? So let's say var modal close element, close button element. The names are getting kind of long. Equals document get element by ID, and I already forgot the ID that we gave it. Modal close button. I'm going to copy this. Okay, and then modal close button element dot add event listener click and on close modal. Right? Glitch is complaining about the fact that we have not defined on close modal, so we have to create a new function on close modal, and I'm just going to copy and paste our stuff from open modal and change the class to invisible instead of visible, right? So we get a hold of our modal box, and then we set its class to the same modal box container that it used to be, and then hidden. Oops, hidden. All right, so let's make it hidden by default. And let's see if our interaction works. So I'm gonna click on open modal box. The modal is showing up, and then I'm gonna click on close and the modal is closing. I was planning to show you how to do a brief, like a simple fade in, fade out animation for this, but this tutorial is getting quite long, so I think I'm going to stop here and maybe cover that in the next video. Yeah, that's it for now. Thank you.